There's something most people don't know about Hashirama Senju. When Masashi Kishimoto first sketched out the world of Naruto, Hashirama wasn't a character you were ever supposed to meet. He was designed as the very first Hokage, the founding leader of the Hidden Leaf Village, but for most of the manga's run, he existed only as a distant legend. His name appeared carved into the mountain, spoken in classrooms, whispered with a kind of reverence. But for years and years, he was a story, not a person. Kishimoto built him to feel like the past itself, the way a nation talks about its founders long after they're gone. And that was intentional. Kishimoto wanted the man who started everything to feel almost mythical, someone so far beyond the ordinary shinobi that even the strongest characters spoke about him in hushed tones. So he gave Hashirama a title that carried enormous weight: the God of Shinobi. It sounds like a throwaway phrase, but within the series, it's one of the rarest ranks anyone can earn. Only a small handful of characters in the entire history of the story are ever described that way, and each of them is considered a generational figure. By attaching that title to Hashirama before we ever saw him fight, Kishimoto planted an expectation. The audience spent years imagining what a god among ninja must actually look like. Now here's where it gets interesting. When Hashirama finally appears in the flesh, brought back later in the story, he isn't the stern, cold, untouchable legend that everyone had pictured. He's the complete opposite. Hashirama is written as a goofy, emotional, warm-hearted man who cries easily, cracks jokes at the worst possible moments, and has a genuine weakness for gambling. This is the God of Shinobi, a man who tears up over sentiment and loses money at games of chance. For a lot of readers, that first real look at him is a shock, because the character they'd built up in their heads was serious and severe, and the character on the page is almost childlike in his emotions. But that contrast wasn't an accident, and it wasn't a mistake. It's one of Kishimoto's most consistent habits as a writer. Again and again, he takes his most powerful characters and makes them the most humble, the most playful, or the most openly emotional. The strength and the softness aren't in conflict. The softness is the point. Hashirama's power is built on his warmth, on his belief in peace and connection between people. So it makes sense that the man himself would be gentle and emotional, rather than hard and menacing. Kishimoto is essentially telling you that the greatest shinobi who ever lived earned that title not by being ruthless, but by caring more than anyone else. And what's really surprising comes next, because you can actually see this idea in the way Hashirama was drawn. His design leans on soft, earthy tones. He wears reds and browns, natural colors, rather than heavy armor or intimidating dark plating. His hair is long and dark and loose, framing a calm face. There's nothing about his appearance that screams warlord. If you didn't know who he was, you might guess he was a healer or a diplomat, before you'd ever guess he was the deadliest fighter of his era. That was a deliberate choice. Kishimoto wanted him to read as a peacemaker first and a warrior second, so that the moment you learn what he's capable of, the gap between how he looks and what he can do lands even harder. It also fits the fabric of the whole Naruto world, because Hashirama's dream was peace. He founded the Hidden Leaf Village on the idea that clans who had spent generations killing each other could instead live and grow together. So a design built around gentleness isn't just a stylistic flourish. It's a visual argument for everything the character stands for. The founder of a village meant to end endless war couldn't look like war itself. He had to look like the thing he was trying to build, which brings the whole picture together in a way that's easy to miss. On paper, Hashirama is a walking contradiction. He's a god of combat who would rather not fight. He's the most respected figure in the history of the ninja world, and he behaves like the least self-important person in any room. He's a founder whose legacy is spoken of with awe, but who himself is warm, silly, and endlessly emotional. And every one of those contradictions was placed there on purpose, because Kishimoto understood that a legend feels more human and therefore more powerful when it's built on kindness rather than fear. So before we go any further into what Hashirama actually did, the village he founded, the battles that made his name, the bloodline that ran through his family, it's worth sitting with this one idea. The God of Shinobi wasn't designed to be feared. He was designed to be loved. His strength was never meant to intimidate you. It was meant to protect the people around him and to prove that the strongest person in the world could also be the gentlest. That's the foundation everything else about him is built on, and it's where his story truly begins. What very few people realize is that wood release was never just a flashy ability the writers handed to a powerful character. It's a Kekkei Genkai, a bloodline limit, and its mechanics are surprisingly specific. To use it, Hashirama simultaneously channels Earth Nature Chakra and Water Nature Chakra, blending the two into something entirely new. Earth gives structure and nutrients, water gives life and growth, and together they let him grow living trees, roots, and entire forests from nothing at all. No seeds, no soil, no waiting. Just raw chakra shaped into living wood, rising up in seconds. But here's the detail that makes it so important to the whole story. Wood release wasn't simply rare, it was considered impossible to replicate. In a world built around the Sharingan copying almost any technique it sees, Kekkei Genkai are the great exception, because they come from something written into the body itself, not from movement or hand signs you can watch and steal. So wood release belonged to Hashirama alone. It was uniquely his, and everyone knew it. And that single fact quietly becomes one of the biggest engines driving the entire plot. Because when something is that powerful and that impossible to obtain, people will go to extraordinary, disturbing lengths to obtain it anyway. And this is where the behind-the-scenes logic of the story really tightens. Orochimaru, obsessed with unlocking every secret of the ninja world, became fixated on recreating Hashirama's ability. He didn't try to learn it, he tried to grow it, biologically, in other people. He took 60 children and experimented on them, attempting to force Hashirama's cells to take root inside their bodies. Out of those 60, 59 died. Only one survived. That survivor grew up to become Yamato, the leaf ninja we later meet as a calm, steady team leader. Most viewers know him as that quiet, dependable man with the round eyes and the stern expression. Very few realize he is quite literally the sole successful result of a horrifying experiment. The one child out of 60 whose body accepted the cells and lived. And even then, the twist is that Yamato's wood release is only a shadow of the original. He can build houses, form barriers, and suppress the nine-tailed fox's chakra, which is genuinely useful. But he could never grow a forest to blot out the sky, or shape a wooden statue the size of a mountain, the way Hashirama could. So the story makes a quiet point here. Even a near-perfect recreation, achieved at the cost of dozens of lives, still lands nowhere near the real thing. Hashirama's power wasn't just rare, it was, in practice, irreplaceable. And this is where it gets genuinely fascinating, because that irreplaceability turns Hashirama's own body into the single most valuable resource in the entire narrative. Not a weapon, not a scroll, his cells. Once you understand that wood release can't be taught, can't be copied by the Sharingan, and can barely be transplanted, it suddenly makes sense why so many hidden plot threads all lead back to the same source. Madara, Hashirama's old rival, secretly took a piece of him and cultivated those cells for decades, eventually growing wood release into his own body to reach a power he could never have had otherwise. Danzo, the shadowy leaf elder, went even further, grafting an entire arm studded with stolen Sharingan and threaded through with Hashirama's cells to keep them alive and under control. Even Obito, even the great tree at the heart of the final conflict, traces back to that same biological inheritance. So, one man's bloodline quietly becomes the connective tissue holding half the story's secrets together. Nearly every major villain, in one way or another, is trying to borrow a fragment of Hashirama. It's a remarkable piece of long-term storytelling, because it means his importance never really fades, even long after his own era ends. The character can be gone, and his influence still spreads through the world like roots under the ground. And that image is not an accident. It connects to something much older than the manga itself. In Japanese folklore and religious tradition, the power to command nature, to make forests grow and bend the living world to your will, has long been associated with divine and enlightened figures, beings closer to a Buddha than to an ordinary human. Control over trees and growth isn't framed as brute strength. It's framed as something serene, almost sacred, the mark of a being who stands above the normal order of things. So when Hashirama uses wood release, he isn't just casting a jutsu. He's stepping into a very old cultural idea of what a godlike figure looks like, calm, immovable, and deeply tied to the land itself. Which is exactly why, later in the story, his likeness appears carved into enormous statues that loom silently over the ninja world, watching from above like a guardian deity. The visual language was chosen on purpose, so wood release ends up being far more than his signature move. It's the reason he's called the God of Shinobi, in a way that goes beyond raw combat. It ties together the folklore, the biology, the villains, and the towering statues into a single idea. He was the one person who could grow life itself from nothing. And because no one could ever truly take that from him, his presence quietly shapes everything that comes after. The story of Madara Uchiha begins not with war, but with a boy sitting alone at the edge of a river, skipping stones across the water. Long before he became the most feared shinobi of his age, Madara was simply a child who had lost most of his brothers to endless conflict, looking for a moment of quiet. And it was there, at that riverbank, that he met another boy doing exactly the same thing. That boy was Hashirama Senju. Neither of them knew, in that moment, that their families were enemies. They only knew that they were both tired, both grieving, and both dreaming of a world where children didn't have to die on battlefields before they ever grew up. What makes this detail so striking is how ordinary it was. The two most powerful ninja who would ever live began their relationship as friends who didn't even exchange their full names, because saying a clan name out loud could turn a friendship into a death sentence. The Senju and the Uchiha had been killing each other for generations, so long that no one could remember how it started. So when Hashirama and Madara finally learned who the other really was, the friendship didn't just end quietly. It became the exact wound that would shape the rest of the story. And this is where Kishimoto's design becomes clear. He built the bond between Hashirama and Madara as a deliberate mirror to Naruto and Sasuke. The parallels are not accidental or loose. One boy is warm, open, and endlessly forgiving. The other is brilliant, proud, and slowly consumed by loss. One believes connection can heal anything. The other becomes convinced that the world is beyond saving. So the founder's story, told mostly in flashback near the end of the series, quietly explains the entire main plot in advance. Everything Naruto struggles to do for Sasuke is something Hashirama already tried and failed to do for Madara decades earlier. But here is the counterintuitive part, the detail that reverses how most people imagine Hashirama. He is remembered as the God of Shinobi, the strongest man of his era, the founder of a village. You would expect his peace to come from strength, from the confidence of someone who could simply force the world to behave. Instead, his peace came from desperation. To convince Madara to trust him and unite their clans, Hashirama offered to kill himself. He literally put a blade to his own body and told Madara that if his death was the price of ending the war, he would pay it without hesitation. This was not a bluff. It was a man so exhausted by the cycle of hatred that he was willing to end his own life if it would break it. His dream of peace wasn't born from power. It was born from grief so deep that death seemed like a fair trade. And yet, what came next surprised even Hashirama, because Madara accepted. He looked at the man willing to die for him, and instead of turning away, he chose, for that moment, to trust. Together they laid down their weapons and founded the Hidden Leaf. But Madara had watched too many of his own brothers die, and somewhere along the way, the peace they built began to feel unsafe to him. In time, he stopped believing that trust could ever hold, and he chose hatred, not out of cruelty, but out of a conviction that the world would only ever betray him again. That slow turn is the hinge the entire Naruto universe turns on. One man offered everything, the other could not hold on to it. And from that single change came decades of consequence. Because Madara turned to hatred, the two friends met one final time, and Hashirama defeated him at a place that would come to be called the Valley of the End. The name itself is not decoration. It marks the end of their friendship, the end of an era, and the end of any chance that the founding of the Hidden Leaf could stay untouched by bloodshed. And if that location sounds familiar, it should. It is the exact same valley where, generations later, Naruto and Sasuke fight their own defining battle. The geography is identical. The stakes are echoed. Kishimoto placed the two most important fights in the series at the very same spot, separated by nearly a century of story. That is why the statues stand there. Carved into the cliffs above the waterfall, two enormous figures face each other across the water, frozen mid-reach. One is Hashirama, the other is Madara. They were built to commemorate the clash that ended their friendship, and they turned the landscape itself into a monument. When Naruto and Sasuke fight beneath those same statues, they are quite literally standing in the shadows of the men whose broken bond they are repeating. The valley remembers what the characters keep forgetting. And this is the quiet record buried in the whole saga. The Valley of the End is the only location in the series to host two generation-defining battles, and both were between a Senju-blooded dreamer and an Uchiha lost to darkness. The scenery is the story. Every stone of that place was shaped by two boys who once skipped rocks across a peaceful river, before they ever knew their names were meant to be enemies. Hashirama built a village, a legacy, and a legend. But the thing that defined him most was the one friend he could never save. Behind the familiar appearance of Konohagakure, the Hidden Leaf village that so many stories begin in, There's a truth that quietly reverses almost everything you'd assume about how a village is born. Because most great cities grow slowly, house by house, generation by generation, shaped by countless hands over centuries. But Konoha didn't grow that way at all. Konoha was built by a single man, in a place where that should never have been possible. The ground the Hidden Leaf now stands on wasn't peaceful land. It was a battlefield. For generations, the Senju and the Uchiha had slaughtered each other on those very fields, staining the soil with the blood of fathers and sons who never lived long enough to grow old. So when Hashirama Senju looked at that scarred earth, he didn't see ruins. He saw the one place worth transforming, precisely because of everything terrible that had happened there. And here's where the story turns strange. Hashirama didn't hire builders. He didn't wait for lumber or stone. He used wood release, his own unique Kekkei Genkai, to literally grow the village out of the land. Buildings rose from the ground like trees reaching for the sky. Where enemy clans had once killed each other, homes and streets and rooftops bloomed into existence, shaped by a single living hand. The Hidden Leaf wasn't constructed so much as it was cultivated, grown the way a forest grows, only faster and with purpose. But a village needs more than walls. It needs a name. And this is the first detail that flips what you'd expect. You'd assume the founder, the man who grew the entire place from nothing, would name his own creation. He didn't. The name Konoha, meaning simply leaf, was chosen by Madara Uchiha, the very man who had spent his life as Hashirama's rival, the enemy across the battlefield, was the one who gave the village its name. The home Hashirama built was christened by the person he'd once been destined to destroy. It's a small thing, easy to miss, but it tells you everything about what these two men were trying to become together. Because the whole point of the village was never conquest. Hashirama's dream was painfully simple, and it grew out of grief. In his era, children were sent to fight in clan wars almost as soon as they could hold a weapon. Boys died before they became men. Hashirama had watched it happen to his own brothers. So he imagined something that had never existed before. A place where clans would lay down their private wars, pool their strength, and let their children grow up instead of sending them out to die. That idea, the idea of a hidden village itself, was his invention. Every hidden village that came after, in every other nation, was built on a concept Hashirama dreamed up first. He didn't just build a village, he invented the very category. But here's what almost nobody knows. The man who created the entire concept of the Hokage, the leader of the Hidden Leaf, didn't actually want the job. You'd think the founder would naturally crown himself. Hashirama did the opposite. He pushed for Madara to lead the village they'd built together. He believed his old rival deserved it, that sharing power was the only way to make peace real. It was only when the villagers overwhelmingly, almost unanimously, chose Hashirama instead that he accepted the title of first Hokage. He became the leader not because he seized the position, but because he was the one man everyone trusted enough to hand it to. Power that's given freely, it turns out, sits very differently from power that's taken. And that reluctance, that refusal to place himself above others, makes the next fact quietly ironic. Look at the Hokage Rock, the great cliff face that watches over the village to this day. Hashirama's face is the first one carved into that mountain. The man who tried to give away his own leadership ended up immortalized in stone before anyone else. His likeness was cut into living rock, earthy and permanent, designed to weather centuries of wind and rain and outlast everyone who ever walked beneath it. That design wasn't random either. A monument carved directly into a mountainside, meant to endure long after its founders are gone, echoes real traditions from our own world. Think of the enormous carved faces of national leaders cut into cliffs, or the ancient stone monuments of Japan, shaped from the mountains themselves. These are structures built with a single, quiet intention: to outlive the hands that made them. The Hokage rock carries that same idea. It isn't decoration. It's memory made permanent. A promise that the people who founded this village will still be watching over it long after the last person who knew them has passed away. So when you picture Konohagakure, remember what's hidden beneath the familiar sight of it. A village grown, not built, named by an enemy, founded on a dream to save children from war, led by a man who never wanted to lead, and crowned by a mountain carved to remember him forever. Every ordinary rooftop in the hidden leaf sits on top of a story that quietly contradicts everything you'd expect a village to be. If you look closely at Tsunade, you start to realize that Hashirama Senju never really left the story. He died long before most of the events we watch unfold, but his blood kept walking through the village he built, and it walked in the form of his granddaughter. Tsunade is the daughter of Hashirama's child, which makes her a direct descendant of the first Hokage himself. That single fact, easy to overlook, quietly explains almost everything strange and powerful about her. Because Tsunade didn't just inherit a famous name, she inherited his monstrous life force, the same overwhelming vitality that let Hashirama regenerate wounds that should have killed him. In Tsunade, that inheritance shows up as something almost unfair. Her healing techniques operate on a level that other medical ninja simply cannot reach. And her creation rebirth technique, the one that lets her regenerate her own body almost instantly, works by accelerating cell division across her entire form. That should be impossible to survive, but she can afford it because she carries the reserves of chakra and life energy passed down from the man who founded the leaf. In other words, the reason Tsunade feels like a cheat code is that she genuinely is one, biologically speaking. But here's where it becomes less about power and more about a strange twist of fate. Tsunade wears a necklace, a small green gem that seems purely decorative at first. That necklace once belonged to Hashirama himself. It was said to be worth enough to buy 3 mountains. So, already, it's an extraordinary heirloom. But its real value has nothing to do with money. That necklace carries a hidden reputation, something almost no one in the village would guess by looking at it. Some fans have theorized that it holds the ability to suppress and help control chakra, and that it might be tied to the Nine Tails. A tiny piece of jewelry, passed quietly from a grandfather to his granddaughter, imagined by that theory as connected to the single most dangerous force in the entire hidden leaf. Think about how easily that could have been lost, sold, or forgotten. Instead, through nothing more than family inheritance, it stayed close to the exact bloodline that founded the village and first faced that beast. And behind all of this hides something even more interesting. That same necklace was said to be cursed. The legend around it claimed that anyone Tsunade loved who wore it would die. Her younger brother Nawaki received it as a gift, dreaming of one day becoming Hokage, and he was killed in battle almost immediately afterward. Later, she gave it to Dan, the man she loved, who shared that same dream of leading the village. He died too. So the same gift that carried Hashirama's power also carried a shadow of grief that seemed to follow it from one generation to the next. Tsunade came to hate that necklace, and she came to hate the dream of becoming Hokage, precisely because everyone she loved who chased it never came back. That's why it matters so much when she finally gives the necklace to Naruto. She bets it on him during their confrontation, telling him that if he can master a technique in a limited time, he can keep it. She fully expects to lose the bet, and, in her mind, to lose him too, the way she lost the others. But Naruto survives. He does the impossible, and he wears the cursed necklace, and he lives. For Tsunade, that moment breaks the curse that had haunted her for decades. It's the point where she chooses to believe in the future again and accepts the title of fifth Hokage. Now step back and look at the larger accident of storytelling here. When Naruto first began, Hashirama was barely present. He existed as an old face carved into the mountain, a name from the past, a legend more than a character. Kishimoto hadn't yet shown the flashbacks that would reveal who the first Hokage truly was, or what he could do. But the writer kept Hashirama alive in the narrative anyway, indirectly, through Tsunade. Every time her healing defied logic, every time that green gem glinted at her chest, the founder's presence was quietly threading through the plot. The audience felt his importance long before they understood it. So Tsunade became a kind of bridge. Through her, Hashirama's life force reached a new generation. Through her necklace, his heirloom reached Naruto, the very boy who carried that same beast sealed inside him. And through her decision to hand that heirloom to Naruto, the grief that clung to Hashirama's gift was finally allowed to lift. What looks like a series of small coincidences, a necklace, a bloodline, a lost bet, turns out to be the founder's legacy arriving exactly where it needed to go. It's easy to think of Hashirama as a figure locked in the past, a statue and a story. But the truth is that his choices, his power, and even his sorrow kept moving forward long after he was gone, carried by a granddaughter who didn't want to lead, resting on a small green stone that changed hands at the perfect moment. The God of Shinobi shaped the story from the very beginning, quietly, patiently, waiting for someone to notice. People rarely talk about Sage Mode when they talk about Hashirama Senju. They talk about his wood release, the forests he could grow with a single gesture, the way he shaped the land itself. But underneath all of that was something quieter, something that connected him to a much older part of the ninja world, a part most people forget he ever touched. Because Hashirama didn't just master wood release, he also mastered Sage Mode. And Sage Mode, at its core, is about borrowing energy from the natural world, drawing in the life around you and folding it into your own chakra. It's a technique tied to sacred places, to ancient animal summons, to traditions that stretch back long before the villages existed. So when Hashirama learned it, he wasn't just adding power. He was quietly linking himself to a lineage most shinobi never even glimpse. Now here's where it gets interesting. Most Sage Mode users carry a mark that tells you exactly where their power comes from. The Toad Sages, like Jiraiya and later Naruto, get pigment around their eyes, orange markings that show their bond with Mount Myoboku. The Snake Sages carry their own signs. But Hashirama's Sage Mode looked different. When he activated it, a red rhombus appeared on his forehead, a shape that belonged to no toad and no snake we'd ever seen. And that's the mystery. Because Kishimoto, the author, never fully explained where Hashirama's sage energy came from. There's no scene of him traveling to a sacred mountain, no summon teaching him the balance of natural energy. His source was simply left open, unexplained, hanging in the background of the story. For a character this powerful, you'd expect an origin. Instead, we got silence. And strangely, that silence made him feel bigger, not smaller. The gap in his story became part of his myth, an unexpected connection to some corner of the world we were never shown. So what did all of this actually let him do? This is where the quiet details start to matter. Hashirama's Sage Mode wasn't a minor upgrade he pulled out once and forgot. It was strong enough to let him stand against Madara Uchiha at Madara's absolute peak. And when I say peak, I mean it. Madara had awakened the Nine Tails, the strongest of the tailed beasts. He had unlocked his eternal Mangekyo Sharingan, the perfected form of the Uchiha's legendary eyes, and used it to bend that fox to his will. He was, in every practical sense, a fully powered final boss, the kind of opponent stories usually save for their very last chapter. But here's the part worth sitting with. Hashirama fought that version of Madara, the complete version, the one with the fox and those perfected eyes, and he won. Not through luck, not through a single lucky strike, but through raw, sustained power. And that's the detail that reshapes how you see him. He wasn't strong for his era. He was strong by any era's standard. And what's really surprising comes next. Because this is the reason Hashirama became a kind of measuring stick for the entire series. When the databooks ranked the founders, the first ninja of the great clans, Hashirama consistently landed at the top. Fans do the same thing. Whenever a new powerful character appears, the question quietly becomes, but could they beat Hashirama? He turned into a benchmark, a line drawn in the sand that later characters are compared against, whether they ever meet him or not. So why did he end up this far ahead of everyone else? It comes down to a combination that almost feels unfair when you lay the pieces side by side. On its own, endless chakra is dangerous. Most ninja have to ration their energy carefully, holding back because they know they'll run dry. Hashirama didn't have that problem. His reserves were so vast that he could keep fighting long after others would have collapsed. But endless chakra alone isn't enough. So layer would release on top of it, a power that could create shelter, restraints, weapons, and even living clones out of nothing but his own energy. And then, on top of that, add Sage Mode, which pulled in the natural energy of the world around him and poured it back into everything he did. Each piece made the others stronger. And when you put those three together, something quietly remarkable happens. He became self-sustaining. He could heal himself without hand signs. He could regenerate. He could fight indefinitely without needing rest, without needing backup, without needing to hold anything in reserve. In a world where every ninja lives and dies by how carefully they spend their chakra, Hashirama simply didn't have to think about it. He was, in a very literal sense, a battlefield that never ran out. That's the practical reason the title stuck. People call him the God of Shinobi, and it's easy to hear that as pure legend, the kind of name that grows in the retelling. But it wasn't just reputation. It was a description of what he could actually do. Endless energy, the power to reshape the land, and a Sage Mode whose true source was never revealed, all woven into one person who could stand alone against the strongest opponent the world could produce, and remain standing when it was over. Curiously enough, Edo Tensei is the reason most of us ever really met Hashirama at all. For the vast majority of the series, the God of Shinobi existed as a legend, a carved face on a mountain, a name spoken with reverence by people who had never seen him move. He was history. He was a statue. He was a story told by other characters, always in the past tense. But long after his death, during the Fourth Great Ninja War, that changed, because the forbidden reanimation technique known as Edo Tensei pulled him back out of the grave and set him down among the living once more. The technique itself is worth understanding, because it shapes everything about how he returns. Edo Tensei binds the soul of a dead person into a living sacrifice, rebuilding the body around it. And the reanimated body carries a signature look, a cracked, ash-gray skin that fractures across the face like dry clay. That design was deliberate. It was meant to signal, at a single glance, the dead brought back against nature, the wrongness of a soul dragged out of rest. So when Hashirama steps onto the battlefield, The audience already knows what those cracks mean. This is not a memory. This is a corpse, animated, standing where a corpse should not stand. And here is where the story does something genuinely unexpected. You would assume that a man called the God of Shinobi, a figure built up for hundreds of chapters as the strongest ninja who ever lived, would return as a grave, towering presence, a silent titan. But he doesn't. The moment reanimated Hashirama opens his mouth, the legend collapses into something almost comic, because it turns out the greatest shinobi in history is a chatterbox. He rambles. He gets distracted. He talks over serious moments with cheerful, wandering commentary. The mythic figure everyone feared for generations reveals himself to be warm, silly, and endlessly talkative. And the contrast between the reputation and the personality is so sharp that he became a fan favorite almost instantly. People had spent the entire series imagining a stone-faced god, and instead, they got a friendly, over-eager man who can't quite read the room. That reversal matters because it tells you something about how the character was constructed. For most of the series, Hashirama was defined entirely by what others said about him, and reputation always flattens a person into a single trait: strength, nobility, sacrifice. But a personality can only be shown, never summarized. And so the only way to let the audience actually meet him was to bring him back and let him speak. The reanimation isn't just a plot event. It's the first time the man is allowed to be a person instead of a monument. And this is where it gets genuinely fascinating, because his return served a second, quieter purpose that had nothing to do with combat. During the war, Hashirama becomes a narrator of his own history. He sits with Sasuke and explains the backstory of the founding of the Hidden Leaf, the friendship and the fracture between himself and Madara, the compromises that built the village, the origins of the conflicts that had shaped every generation that followed. Kishimoto used the reanimation partly as a storytelling device, a way to finally deliver the founder's true history straight from the mouth of the man who lived it. The dead were brought back not only to fight, but to testify. Everything the series had implied about its own origins, everything that had been rumor and fragment and legend, was suddenly laid out plainly, because the one witness who could confirm it had been given a voice again. So the technique that violates nature ends up doing something oddly generous. It closes the distance between the audience and a character who had always been kept at arm's length. Consider the shape of it. The entire series had treated Hashirama as foundational, the root from which everything else grew, and yet the audience never actually knew him. They knew his cells, passed down and transplanted into others. They knew his powers, the wood release and the vast healing and the ability to reshape the land. They knew his shadow, cast across every arc. But they did not know the man, because the man had died before the story began. It's a strange thing to say about a character so central, but many readers will tell you honestly that they only truly met Hashirama in the war arc. And that is the lasting impact of his reanimation. It reframes his entire legacy. Before the war, his greatness was abstract, a set of numbers and legends and inherited gifts. After the war, that greatness has a face and a voice and a personality attached to it, which makes everything that came before feel heavier, more human. The powers matter more once you've met the person wielding them. The sacrifices matter more once you've heard him laugh. The God of Shinobi spent almost the whole series as a statue and a story, and it took a forbidden technique, a broken taboo, and a body of cracked gray skin to finally let him speak. When he did, the legend didn't shrink. It simply became someone you could recognize, which is a far more durable kind of immortality than any jutsu could grant. Originally, Senju Clan wasn't even a name Kishimoto invented from nothing. He borrowed a phrase, Senju, which translates roughly to 1,000 hands, or, in a looser reading, 1,000 skills. It was a quiet nod to the idea that this clan had mastered every kind of jutsu ever devised, every element, every technique, every discipline. And Hashirama was meant to sit at the very top of that reputation, the living proof of what 1,000 skills could look like folded into a single man. So the name wasn't decoration, it was a promise the character had to keep. But here's where the story starts to fold back on itself in a way that's easy to miss. The Senju and the Uchiha, those two clans that spent literal centuries hunting each other across battlefields, weren't strangers at all. They descended from the same source. Both bloodlines trace back to the two sons of the Sage of the Six Paths, one son who inherited the body and one who inherited the eyes, which means the men who slaughtered each other for generations, who buried their children and swore revenge and kept the feud burning long past the point of memory, were distant cousins. The oldest hatred in the setting was, underneath everything, a family argument that never ended. Because the Senju were framed as the descendants of the body, the line that valued love, cooperation, and the strength found in others rather than in oneself, Kishimoto wrote Hashirama to carry that philosophy in an almost extreme form. His friendliness wasn't just a personality quirk, it was clan doctrine made flesh. When Hashirama extends trust to an enemy who has every reason to betray him, that isn't naivety. It's the body-descendant worldview taken to its logical endpoint. A man so committed to connection that he'll offer his own life to prove the point. So the thing that looks like sweetness is actually the deepest expression of what his bloodline was designed to believe. And that design shows up even in the small visual details. The Senju Clan symbol resembles a stylized wooden marker, a simple shape that quietly ties back to Hashirama's signature ability to shape living wood out of nothing. So Kishimoto leaned into a green and nature motif for the whole clan, and he used it deliberately. In nearly every panel where a Senju and an Uchiha share the frame, you'll notice the contrast. The calm green of growing things set against the aggressive red of fire. The color language does the storytelling before a single word is spoken. Now, yet the most unexpected part is still to come, because this is where the angle of a famous mistake quietly enters the picture. The Senju were written as the strongest clan of their entire era. Not one of the strongest, the strongest, full stop. They were the family other clans measured themselves against. So you'd expect a bloodline like that to spread, to dominate, to fill the world with heirs carrying that power forward. But the opposite happened. After Hashirama and, generations later, his granddaughter Tsunade, the Senju line essentially vanishes. The God of Shinobi, the man who embodied 1,000 skills, came from a family that nearly died out entirely. And that fade isn't an accident of the plot, so much as a kind of narrative glitch that fans turned into something meaningful. The Uchiha kept appearing, generation after generation. Madara, Obito, Itachi, Sasuke. A bloodline that refused to leave the stage. The Senju, meanwhile, quietly emptied out until Tsunade stood as almost the last recognizable drop of that blood. So the strongest clan became, functionally, the rarest. The victors of the old war left fewer traces than the clan they defeated. It's an odd inversion, and because the story never fully explains it, readers filled the silence themselves, treating the Senju's disappearance as proof of a strange truth about power, that the families who burn brightest often burn out first. But that reading only works because Hashirama himself was designed to be the exception that outlives the rule. His cells, his healing, his wood release, all of it got harvested, copied, and scattered into other characters long after the clan's own numbers collapsed. So in a sense, the Senju didn't survive as a family. They survived as an ingredient. The bloodline dissolved, but the biology kept circulating through the story, showing up in transplants and experiments and borrowed power. The clan died as a name and lived on as a component, which is a strange fate for the family that once considered itself the peak of everything. So when you step back, the Senju become one of those quiet contradictions the series never quite resolves. A clan named for 1,000 skills, reduced to a handful of survivors. A bloodline built on love and cooperation, defined most by a war it couldn't stop fighting. A family that produced the single strongest shinobi of an age, and then nearly disappeared from the world he helped build. The mistake, if you can call it that, was never corrected. It was simply absorbed into the legend until it felt inevitable. And that's the thing about Hashirama's line. What made it fragile and what made it eternal turned out to be exactly the same trait. One often overlooked detail about Chakra when it comes to Hashirama Senju is that his power was never really framed as a technique at all. It was framed as inheritance. And that distinction matters more than it first appears, because when Kishimoto needed an in-universe reason for why so many later characters ended up so absurdly strong, he didn't invent a new jutsu or a new weapon. He reached back to Hashirama's body. His life force and his chakra reserves were written to be so vast that his cells alone could rewrite a person's abilities. That's a strange thing to build a story around. Not a sword, not a sealed beast, but the biology of a single man. So the writers leaned into that idea, and it created a quiet ripple effect through the entire series. Because if Hashirama's cells could reshape someone's potential, then his DNA becomes a resource, not just a memory. But the tension there is obvious the moment you think about it. A resource that valuable, sitting inside one body, is going to be wanted by everyone. Therefore, Hashirama's flesh becomes, without exaggeration, the most stolen and cloned material in the whole story. A single fragment of it sustained Madara for decades. That same fragment, grafted into ordinary people with no special lineage, was enough to awaken abilities they were never born with. The body outlived the man by generations, and it kept working. Now, here's where the counterintuitive part comes in, and it's the detail that quietly reframes how you read every medical arc in the series. Healing in Naruto is supposed to be hard. Medical ninjutsu is presented as one of the most demanding disciplines there is. Tsunade spent a lifetime mastering precise chakra control just to close wounds with hand seals and perfect timing. It's treated as an elite skill, something only a handful of people on the continent can do at the highest level. But Hashirama could heal without hand seals at all. Not through study, not through technique. He did it as a passive side effect of raw vitality. So the thing that others trained their entire lives to earn, he simply had, running quietly in the background, whether he willed it or not. And that's the part that turns his character from strong into almost unkillable. Kishimoto tied Hashirama's regenerative power directly to his wood release. So the very same energy that grew forests out of bare ground, that made trees erupt across a battlefield in seconds, was the energy that knitted his own wounds shut. Growth outward and growth inward were the same force. Therefore, in open combat, striking him didn't accomplish much, because the damage closed almost as fast as it was made. You couldn't win by wearing him down, because there was nothing to wear down. But here's what almost nobody notices, and it's where the hidden cultural thread underneath all of this starts to show. The databooks rank his chakra among the highest ever recorded in the series, and they do it without giving him a special eye, without a tailed beast, without any external artifact. Every other top-tier power tends to come with a gimmick attached. A Sharingan, a Rinnegan, a sealed monster. Hashirama's ranking comes purely from biological inheritance, traced back to the sage's lineage. And that's not an accident of power scaling. It's a deliberate echo of a much older idea. Because if you look at where Kishimoto drew from, Naruto is built quietly on Buddhist and Shinto concepts, and the word chakra itself isn't invented. It comes from Sanskrit, chakra, meaning wheel or disc, and in Indian spiritual tradition, it refers to centers of life energy running through the body. So when the series treats Hashirama's power as something that flows through his cells, rather than something he casts, it's actually much closer to the original meaning of the word than the flashy energy blasts most fans picture. The Sage of Six Paths, the origin figure of all this, carries clear traces of the historical Buddha and of Buddhist cosmology. And Hashirama, as a direct descendant of that lineage, inherits the idea in its purest form. His strength isn't a spell, it's life force itself, the closest the series comes to its own source material. So the God of Shinobi title starts to read a little differently once you see that. It's usually taken as a compliment about combat, but the layered reference underneath suggests something quieter, that Hashirama represents raw, undirected vitality, the kind of energy that predates technique entirely. Wood release grows life. His body heals life. His cells extend life into others long after he's gone. Everything about the character circles back to that single word and to the tradition the word was borrowed from. Which is why, in the end, his power feels less like a jutsu and more like a natural law. He didn't earn his chakra through training or through a stolen eye. He inherited it, the way a forest inherits the ability to grow. And because it lived in his body rather than his skill, it could be taken, copied, and passed forward, surviving in fragments across the whole story. The most stolen resource in the series turned out not to be a weapon at all. It was simply the thing that word always meant: life, moving through a body and refusing to stop. Here's something genuinely fascinating about Ninetales, and it starts with a detail that most people simply take for granted. When you watch the modern era of the story, Kurama is treated as a force of pure catastrophe. A single one of its tails can level a mountainside. Its chakra alone can flatten a village. Entire nations organize their militaries around the fear of what a tailed beast could do if it ever slipped its leash. And yet, before all of that, there was one man who stood in front of the strongest of the nine and simply refused to let it move. Hashirama Senju is the only human, besides the Sage of the Six Paths himself, ever shown physically suppressing a fully rampaging Kurama, not sealing it, not bargaining with it, pinning it to the ground. His wood release grew out of the earth and wrapped around the beast until the creature that terrorized whole countries was held in place like an animal caught in a net. That single image was Kishimoto's way of telling you exactly how large Hashirama loomed over everyone who came after him. The monsters that defined the modern age were, to him, obstacles he could kneel on. But here's where it becomes interesting, because that power created a problem nobody expected. Once Hashirama had captured not just Kurama, but all nine-tailed beasts, he was left holding the single greatest concentration of raw chakra in the world. He could have kept them. He could have made his own village untouchable, a fortress no rival could ever hope to challenge. So the obvious move, the safe move, was to hoard that strength for the leaf alone. He didn't. And this is the choice that quietly reshaped everything. Hashirama valued peace above victory, so instead of keeping the beasts, he handed them out. He distributed the tailed beasts to rival villages as a gesture of balance, an attempt to keep any single nation from growing strong enough to start another war. On paper, it was almost noble. Spread the power evenly, and no one has a reason to fight. But the consequence of that generosity is one of the darkest threads in the entire series. Because the moment those beasts were given away, someone had to hold them. And that is how the Jinchuriki system was born. The God of Shinobi, the man who wanted nothing more than to end the endless cycle of children dying in wars, is directly responsible for the practice of sealing living weapons inside human beings. Every Jinchuriki who suffered afterward, every child raised as a vessel and feared as a monster, traces back to that peace offering. He tried to end suffering, so he built a system that manufactured a new kind of suffering entirely. The series never lets you forget that irony. The peace was real, but it was built on the backs of the very people meant to carry it. And behind all of this hides something even more interesting, because the first person to bear that burden wasn't a stranger, it was his own wife. Mito Uzumaki became the very first Jinchuriki of Kurama. The Nine Tails, the beast Hashirama had personally wrestled to the ground, was sealed away inside a member of his own family. So the chain didn't begin with some distant sacrifice. It began at home. Mito carried Kurama, and when her time passed, the burden moved to Kushina Uzumaki, and from Kushina it passed, on the night of his birth, to Naruto himself. The entire arc of the main character's life, the loneliness, the fear, the whispered hatred of the villagers, all of it can be drawn back in a straight line to a decision Hashirama made generations earlier, in the name of harmony. That's the version of Hashirama that quietly runs underneath his legend. Not the smiling founder, the man whose kindness set a tragic loop in motion. Now, here's the part that fits the idea of a concept that never fully arrived. In much of the early material, the tailed beasts were treated almost as objects. Chakra to be divided, tools to be balanced, resources to be traded between nations like territory on a map. Hashirama himself seems to have viewed them that way at first, as pieces on a board that could be arranged to keep the peace. The idea that these creatures had names, memories, personalities, and genuine grief, that Kurama was a thinking being rather than a weapon, is something the story only reveals much later. So the founder who handed them out never truly saw them as what they were. He weaponized creatures whose inner imbalance would, ironically, spark the very wars he was trying to prevent. That's the tragedy Kishimoto builds into him. Hashirama used his control over the beasts to cement himself as a mythic figure, someone whose strength dwarfed the modern age. But that same strength let him make a choice no one else could have made, and that choice echoed forward for decades. The most powerful man of his era ended wars by planting the seeds of the next ones. And so the beast he once pinned to the earth would rise again, generation after generation, until it finally reached a boy who inherited both the burden and, eventually, the chance to break the loop for good. There's something most people don't know about Valley of the End. It isn't a natural landmark at all. That canyon, that waterfall, those towering cliffs, none of it existed before two men decided to end their friendship there. The valley was carved out by the final clash between Hashirama Senju and Madara Uchiha, two rivals whose power was so absolute that their last battle didn't just injure the land, it reshaped it. The ground split, the river changed course, and when the dust settled, the geography itself had been rewritten by a single fight. But Kishimoto didn't stop at the terrain. Look closely at the two enormous statues that face each other across the water, frozen mid-reach, and you'll realize they aren't decoration, they're portraits. One statue is Hashirama, the other is Madara. They were sculpted in-universe to mark the site of that duel, literal stone likenesses of the two men who nearly destroyed each other here.
So every time a character stands in that valley, they're standing between the carved faces of the founders, dwarfed by the ancestors whose quarrel shaped the world they live in. That detail matters because Kishimoto used it deliberately. Years later in the story, when Naruto and Sasuke have their own falling out and finally come to blows, the author didn't invent a new arena for them. He sent them back here. The same waterfall, the same two statues, the same crushing symmetry. Naruto ends up standing at the feet of the Hashirama statue. Sasuke stands beneath Madara. Nothing has to be said out loud. The scenery does the talking, quietly promising the audience that history is repeating itself, that this old wound between two clans has reopened in two new boys. A piece of background art became a prophecy. And here's where it gets interesting, because the way people remember this place is often wrong. The clash between Hashirama and Madara is framed like an epic, endless duel between equals, two gods trading blows forever. But that's not actually what happened. Hashirama won, decisively. He didn't just defeat Madara at the Valley of the End. He struck him down there. The founder of the Uchiha clan was believed to have died at that waterfall, beaten by the man who would become the first Hokage. For all the mythology built around their rivalry, the fight had a clear ending, and Hashirama walked away from it. Which raises an obvious question. If Madara fell here, how did he become the villain looming over the entire Fourth Shinobi World War generations later? And the answer is almost absurd when you say it plainly. Madara faked his death. Before that final battle, he had already secretly taken some of Hashirama's cells, and he used them to cheat the end that was coming for him. He let the world believe he'd fallen at the valley, then slipped away to spend decades in the shadows, plotting. So the single greatest threat in the series existed only because one man refused to accept the outcome of a duel he'd already lost. The war that nearly ended everything traces straight back to a corpse that was never really a corpse. But what's really surprising comes next, because the name itself is doing double duty, and Kishimoto knew exactly what he was doing when he chose it. Valley of the End. On the surface, it marks an ending, the end of the long, bloody war between the Senju and the Uchiha, the two clans whose feud defined an entire era. That's the historical meaning. But decades later, in the exact same spot, the name takes on a second life. It becomes the place where Naruto and Sasuke's childhood bond finally breaks, the emotional end of everything they were to each other as kids. Same valley, same word. Two completely different endings, separated by generations, layered on top of one another so that the location carries both at once. The name was a setup planted long before the payoff ever arrived. And when you understand that, the visual design starts to feel less like scenery and more like a deliberate stage. The scale is enormous on purpose. Kishimoto uses that scale and that near-perfect symmetry to make individual shinobi look tiny. A single character standing in the valley is a speck against those cliffs, a small figure beneath the weight of statues carved to remember men far more powerful than they are. The composition constantly reminds you that these people are living inside a conflict they didn't start, one that was already ancient before they were born.
So the Valley of the End isn't really about one fight, or even two. It's a place built out of consequence, carved by a battle, marked with the faces of the men who fought it, misremembered as a stalemate when it was actually a death, named for an ending that would quietly repeat itself decades later. Everything about it points backward to Hashirama and forward to the boy who would one day stand in his shadow. And that's the quiet genius of it. A canyon, a waterfall, and two silent statues, carrying the entire history of a shattered friendship, waiting patiently for the next pair of rivals to arrive and repeat it all over again. What very few people realize is that Hokage, the title itself, didn't exist before Hashirama. Kishimoto didn't inherit the word from Japanese folklore or some older mythology. He built it from the ground up, specifically for this one character. The word breaks down into hi, meaning fire, and kage, meaning shadow. Fire shadow. And the meaning is deliberate. The Hokage is the leader who stands over the village hidden in the leaves, the settlement Hashirama personally founded, casting a protective shadow the way a great tree shelters everything growing beneath it. So the entire concept of the role was reverse-engineered from the man. The title came second. Hashirama came first. But here's the part that quietly undercuts everything you'd assume about a founder. Hashirama didn't actually want to be Hokage. He wasn't chasing the position, and he certainly didn't crown himself. When the village was still new and the leadership needed to be decided, Hashirama's first instinct was to nominate Madara, his rival, the man he'd spent a lifetime fighting and reconciling with. He genuinely proposed that Madara take the seat, because he believed sharing power was the only way the peace would hold. And that decision, that gesture meant as an olive branch, became the seed of the collapse. Because it wasn't up to Hashirama. The villagers chose, and they chose Hashirama over Madara, without hesitation. So the very moment designed to include Madara ended up isolating him instead. He watched the people rally behind Hashirama, and he read it not as a democratic outcome, but as proof that he would always be the outsider, always be second. Kishimoto placed that quiet rejection at the exact fault line where Madara begins to drift toward everything he later becomes. One vote. That's where it cracks. Now, if you look at the Hokage monument, that cliff carved with the faces of every leader, Hashirama's is the first. He sits at the far end, the origin point, and every Hokage who follows is sculpted beside him in sequence. And that ordering isn't decorative. It's a permanent, physical statement that the entire institution traces back to a single person's dream. The dream of ending an era where children were sent to die in clan wars before they were old enough to understand why. Every leader who inherits that mountain inherits that dream with it. And this is where it gets genuinely fascinating, because Kishimoto used Hashirama's time as Hokage to plant an idea that outlives him by generations. It's called the will of fire. The belief is simple to state and enormous in practice. A true leader loves the village the way you'd love your own family, and each generation passes that flame to the next, keeping it burning. Hashirama embodies it first, but the philosophy doesn't stay with him. It threads directly through the entire series. When Naruto talks about protecting his precious people, when he refuses to abandon anyone, he's channeling a doctrine that was written into the world through Hashirama decades before Naruto was ever born. The main character's whole moral compass is, in a sense, an inheritance from the first Hokage. But the most counterintuitive piece of Hashirama's legacy is the one that works against everything he was trying to build. He created the hidden village. Konoha was the first of its kind, a place where multiple clans, who had spent centuries slaughtering each other for hire, agreed to live together under one banner and one leader. It was meant to end the fighting. It was meant to be the cure. And it worked so well, so visibly, that the other great clans across the world looked at it and immediately copied the blueprint. So within a remarkably short span, you get the hidden sand, the hidden mist, the hidden cloud, the hidden stone. The 5 great villages, each one modeled on the very system Hashirama invented. But that's the trap. Because now, instead of clans fighting clans, you had nations fighting nations, each with a Hokage-equivalent leader, each with its own founding dream, each convinced its people came first. Hashirama had tried to end war by uniting the clans. Instead, he accidentally invented the framework that let war scale up to a global level. The Shinobi World Wars, the ones that shadow the entire timeline of the series, are only possible because the hidden village system existed to organize them. The cure became the structure for the disease. And Kishimoto never lets that irony resolve neatly. Hashirama is written as almost impossibly idealistic, a man who believed sincerely that people could simply choose to stop hurting each other. His power on the battlefield was legendary, but the story keeps quietly reminding you that his real ambition was peace, and that peace kept slipping through his fingers even as he held the most powerful position in the world. He founded the village, he defined the title, he authored the philosophy, and he still couldn't make it hold. So when you stand back and look at the whole picture, the first Hokage isn't just a strong ninja at the top of a mountain. He's the origin of the word, the origin of the role, the origin of the ideal, and, unintentionally, the origin of the very conflicts the ideal was meant to prevent. One man's dream, carved into stone, and still casting its shadow over everyone who came after. The story of Tobirama Senju tends to get told in his brother's shadow, which is fitting, because that shadow is exactly where Kishimoto placed him. If Hashirama was warmth, trust, and the dream of peace made flesh, Tobirama was designed as the deliberate opposite, cold, calculating, and endlessly suspicious. He was the younger of the two Senju brothers, and he would become the second Hokage. But here's the record that almost nobody notices at first glance. For a character built to stand in someone else's light, Tobirama quietly holds one of the most impressive resumes in the entire series. Think about it this way. When people picture the man who invented the shinobi world, they picture Hashirama, the founder, the god of shinobi, the face on the mountain. But when you actually count the institutions that shaped the village, almost none of them trace back to Hashirama. They trace back to his brother. Tobirama created the Ninja Academy, the system that trained every young shinobi you ever watched grow up. He established the Konoha military police force. He organized the village's structure into something that could actually govern itself. So the surprising statistic is simple. The warm, beloved founder built the dream, but the cold younger brother built the machinery that made the dream survive. And that pattern goes deeper than administration. Tobirama was a jutsu inventor on a level few ninja ever reached. The Flying Thunder God technique, the space-time teleportation later made famous by Minato in the Fourth Great Ninja War, that was Tobirama's creation. The Shadow Clone technique, so fundamental that it becomes Naruto's signature move, also came from him. But the one that defines his legacy is darker. Tobirama invented Edo Tensei, the forbidden reanimation jutsu that raises the dead to fight. It's the kind of technique Hashirama, for all his raw power, never touched. So we get this quiet contrast. The god of shinobi was stronger, yet it was his younger brother who kept pushing into the forbidden corners of what jutsu could do. That difference wasn't just personality, it came from biology. Hashirama possessed wood release, a Kekkei Genkai so rare it was considered nearly unique to him, a bloodline ability people spent decades trying to replicate through experiments and stolen cells. Tobirama inherited none of it, not a trace. So instead of chasing a power he could never have, he leaned entirely into what he did have, water release and pure, overwhelming speed. He became one of the fastest shinobi of his era, mastering water techniques that let him fight without any bloodline advantage at all. And this quietly proves something the fans debate to this day. The Senju's most legendary gifts didn't pass smoothly down the family line. Hashirama's wood release essentially died with Hashirama.
It didn't flow to his brother, and it didn't flow to his descendants in any reliable way. The god's signature power was, in a sense, a dead end. And yet the most unexpected part is still to come, because for all his invention and skill, Tobirama's real influence on the story isn't a jutsu at all. It's a philosophy, and a dangerous one. Kishimoto used the two brothers to represent two competing visions of how peace could actually work. Hashirama believed peace came from trust. Bring your enemies close, extend your hand, and hope the bond holds. Tobirama believed the opposite, that peace came from control. Watch your enemies, contain the threats, and never assume goodwill will be enough. He was deeply, openly suspicious of the Uchiha clan, convinced that their emotional intensity made them a liability the village couldn't afford to ignore. So here's the uncomfortable resolution. Much of Konoha's later darkness, the marginalization of the Uchiha, their gradual isolation, the resentment that eventually exploded into tragedy, grew directly out of Tobirama's harder approach. His logic was consistent. It was even, in a narrow way, effective. But the seeds of one of the series' greatest catastrophes were planted by the very man trying to keep the village safe. Two brothers, two theories of peace, and it turns out the colder theory left the deeper scars. But if you stop there, you miss the human piece that makes all of this land. Because underneath the stern face, the forbidden jutsu, and the ruthless pragmatism, Tobirama idolized his older brother, genuinely.
He looked up to Hashirama the way a younger sibling looks up to someone they can never quite match, with admiration, a little envy, and a fierce need to protect what his brother built. Everything he created, in a sense, was in service of Hashirama's dream, even when his methods contradicted his brother's heart. He wanted the dream to last longer than the man who dreamed it, and that's what quietly grounds the whole legend. Hashirama's story could have floated off into pure myth, the God of Shinobi, the founder, the face in the stone. But Tobirama keeps it human. He reminds you that behind the mythology was a real relationship. Two brothers who argued about how to hold a fragile peace together. One believed in trust, one believed in control. And the village they built carried both of them forward. The warmth and the wariness, the dream and the machinery, forever tangled together, long after both brothers were gone. Behind the familiar appearance of reincarnation, there's a detail that quietly rewrites everything you thought you understood about Hashirama Senju. Because for most of the story, his rivalry with Madara looks like a simple thing. Two gifted boys, two clans, one dream that curdled into war. It feels personal. It feels like the product of choices, of temperament, of two men who happen to want different things. But late in the series, Kishimoto revealed something that turns that whole reading on its head. Hashirama, he told us, was not simply Hashirama. He was the reincarnation of Asura Otsutsuki, the younger son of the sage of the six paths. Now, sit with that for a moment, because it changes the shape of the entire conflict. We tend to assume that a rivalry is born in the present, that it grows out of the people living it. But this reveal suggests the opposite. The clash between Hashirama and Madara wasn't new at all. It was ancient. It was a cycle that had been turning for generations, long before either of them drew breath, reaching all the way back to two brothers who disagreed about how the world should be held together. What looked like history was actually myth wearing history's clothes. And here's the counterintuitive part. We like to believe that a person's character is theirs alone, that Hashirama's warmth, his openness, his stubborn faith in people, all of it belonged to him. But if Asura's spirit lived on inside him, then that friendly, cooperative nature wasn't purely his own invention. It was Asura's philosophy, reborn. The idea that strength comes from love, from bonds, from trusting others rather than dominating them. That wasn't something Hashirama discovered on his own. In a strange way, part of who he was had been written thousands of years before he was born. His most defining trait was, in a sense, an inheritance he never knew he was carrying. That reframes the man completely, because we usually see Hashirama as the one who chose peace, who chose trust, who reached out his hand to a rival again and again. And he did choose those things. But underneath the choosing was a current older than the choice, a soul that had already leaned this way once before and was leaning that way again. But here's what almost nobody knows. This same reincarnation lineage doesn't stop with Hashirama. It runs forward, through time, all the way to Naruto Uzumaki. Naruto carries the same spirit, the reincarnation of Asura, which means Kishimoto was drawing a single, deliberate thread from one man to another across generations. And suddenly, a lot of small things start to make sense. Fans had noticed for years that Hashirama and Naruto looked oddly alike. The same broad smile, the same refusal to give up on people, the same insistence that enemies could become friends. It was easy to write that off as coincidence, or as a mentor and student echoing each other. But it wasn't coincidence at all. They resemble each other because, on some level, they are the same soul, separated by lifetimes. So the resemblance you might have dismissed as a stylistic quirk turns out to be the whole point. The story was quietly telling you they were connected long before it ever explained how. And this is where the reveal does something clever. It reaches backward and explains a question the story had left hanging for a very long time. How could Hashirama match Madara so evenly? Madara was, by almost every measure, a monster of raw talent, one of the most powerful shinobi to ever live. And yet Hashirama could stand against him, blow for blow, without ever tipping the balance permanently in either direction. That kind of perfect equilibrium is strange. Real fights usually have a clear, stronger side. But if these two were destined counterparts, Asura and Indra, the two suns, balanced against each other by the sage's original blessing, then the even match isn't a coincidence either. It's structural. Their souls were built to mirror each other. Neither could truly overwhelm the other, because they were two halves of the same ancient design. But here's the part that's easy to miss, and it's the most honest detail of all. Kishimoto has admitted that much of this cosmic backstory was developed later in the manga's run. The Sage of the Six Paths, the reincarnation cycle, Asura and Indra. A lot of that framework came into focus well after Hashirama's story had already been told, which means the mythological weight around him was, in part, reverse-engineered. The grand cosmic explanation was built after the fact, to give the whole saga a spine of destiny it didn't originally have. And there's something quietly fascinating in that, because it means the sense of ancient inevitability you feel around Hashirama, the feeling that his life was part of something vast and predetermined, was itself constructed backward, layered on top of a story that began as something smaller and more human. Two boys by a river, two brothers with a dream. Only later did all of it become the reincarnation of gods. So the man we started with, the friendly leader, the founder, the one who simply believed in people, turns out to be the newest face of a spirit that had been trying to make peace for thousands of years, and would keep trying long after he was gone. If you look closely at Sakura Haruno, you start to notice something that almost feels like an accident of history, a lucky twist that connects her, quietly, to the very man we've been talking about all this time. Because Hashirama Senju is remembered as the God of Shinobi, the founder who could raise forests from bare earth and stand toe-to-toe with Madara Uchiha. But one of his most lasting legacies isn't his own power at all. It's the healing arts that eventually flowed down, generation by generation, until they reached Sakura through his granddaughter, Tsunade. And here's the part that surprises most people. Hashirama's monstrous vitality, his ability to regenerate from wounds that would have killed anyone else, wasn't just brute strength or good luck on the battlefield. Kishimoto wrote his life force as something so abundant, so overflowing, that it could actually mend flesh, his own, and in theory, others too. So that wasn't merely a cool trait for a legendary warrior. That same principle, that idea that raw vitality could be channeled into healing, became the quiet foundation of medical ninjutsu itself. The very art that Sakura would one day master traces back, conceptually, to the body of a man who lived generations before she was born. Now, because Hashirama's cells carried this extraordinary regenerative quality, they became one of the most sought-after things in the entire story. Scientists like Orochimaru became obsessed with them, harvesting them, experimenting on them, trying to graft that power into other bodies. But that's the darker branch of the tree. The brighter branch went a different way. Ordinary healers didn't want to steal Hashirama's cells. They studied the theory behind that vitality instead. They asked a simpler question. If one man's life force could knit his body back together, could that same energy be understood, refined, and taught? And that's exactly why the 100 healings technique, the one Tsunade eventually passed to Sakura, echoes Hashirama's endurance so closely. It stores up chakra over time and releases it to regenerate the body, a deliberate, disciplined version of what Hashirama simply did by nature. So follow that thread, and you land on a strange little contradiction. Here's a man famed for leveling forests, for splitting mountains, for battling the most dangerous shinobi of his age. But when you weigh everything he left behind, Hashirama is arguably more influential in the series for saving lives than for taking them. His bloodline didn't just produce a Hokage or two. It defined an entire generation of medic nin. And behind all of this hides something even more interesting. Because the connection isn't only about cells and chakra, it's about intention. Tsunade, Hashirama's granddaughter, watched people she loved die. Her brother, the man she cared for, and she turned that grief into a lifelong mission to keep others alive. She became the greatest medical ninja the world had ever seen, and she rebuilt the entire medical corps of the Hidden Leaf around one rule: that every squad in the field should carry a healer. So the lineage of the God of War quietly became the lineage of guardians of life. And when Tsunade looked for someone to inherit that knowledge, she didn't choose a prodigy born with overwhelming chakra. She chose Sakura, a girl with sharp control, careful precision, and, crucially, the emotional resolve to keep going when it mattered most. That's the lucky twist. Sakura started the story as arguably the weakest member of Team 7, overshadowed by Naruto's raw power and Sasuke's genius. But it was precisely her fine chakra control, a quality that seemed unremarkable early on, that made her the perfect student for medical ninjutsu. The very thing that once looked like a limitation turned out to be the exact talent the healing arts demanded. So the girl who felt left behind ended up carrying a technique whose roots reach all the way back to the founder of the village. And there's a design behind this that feels deliberate, where the Uchiha are said to love so intensely that loss can twist them toward vengeance, the so-called curse of hatred. The Senju are remembered as the clan that built, that gave, that carried the will of fire toward peace. So it's genuinely fitting, almost poetic in its structure, that Hashirama's line produced two of the most gifted healers in Konoha's history.
Tsunade and Sakura, a grandmother by blood and a student by choice, both dedicated to mending, rather than breaking. The circle closes neatly. From the god of war to the guardians of life, the giving clan gave the world its greatest gift of all, the ability to pull people back from the edge. So the next time Hashirama comes up, remembered for his overwhelming strength, it's worth pausing on the quieter truth. His most enduring impact might not be the battles he won or the forests he grew, but the simple, almost accidental fact that his body held a secret about life itself, a secret that ordinary healers decoded, that Tsunade perfected, and that Sakura carried into a new generation. The God of Shinobi, without ever meaning to, became the origin point of the art of healing, and that might be the most human thing about him.
And so we close this quiet journey through the world of Naruto, its hidden secrets and gentle anecdotes, all the way to Sakura Haruno's final steps. Thank you for wandering these stories with me tonight, as sleep drifts softly in. Now let these tales carry you gently into the dark. Sweet dreams.